The property editor is a tool designed to maximize player interaction with the objects in the environment and the world space to make a mechanic that is fun for the explorer player type to play with. The focus of the mechanic is to provide a range of different solutions to various puzzles that the player must use creative lateral thinking to achieve, effectively creating their own solutions to problems by using the mechanic, rather than reaching the solution by any one single means. Through developing with the mechanic, I had hoped to achieve a sense of creative catharsis in the player whenever they reach the goal through their efforts of creatively playing with the mechanic until they form their own solution to the puzzle. The end goal of the mechanic is to allow the player to chart their own journey to the solution of a problem by giving them the freedom to explore the properties of worldly objects and to design my puzzles to match. Though despite my goals of trying to create a mechanic to emphasize player freedom, I learned through research and over the course of development that sometimes restriction or false freedom can be even more important. By implementing various different methods of restricting the mechanic in a non-obstructive way, such as creating minimum and maximum values for materials and even a certain amount of objects that can be stasis at any one time, I learned that not only is creating these kind of restrictions core to the reality of creating rules for games, but that these rules helped to apply a unique purpose to each property that I was designing. Thanks to my research into Tracy Fullerton's game design workshop, I learned that systems are mostly comprised of three core elements: objects, properties, and relationships. Think of a game of chess. The objects consist of the chess pieces and the board. These objects all have properties, such as colors, shapes, and sizes. The one thing that turns it into a system, however, are its relationships. Without these, all you'd have is a collection of objects. The pawn's relationship to the chessboard involves its movement pattern on the square tiles of the board itself, along with the relationships of its surrounding chess pieces and their current positions on the board. My mechanic was an attempt at applying this systemic philosophy of game design and creating a tool that could edit specific properties of objects, in which all have a relationship to each other as well as the world itself. These restrictions also work to increase the endogenous value in the player's psychology during play by making each property have its own values directly tied to its material, hopefully creating a small system for the player to experiment with. These restrictions and rules created more of a challenge for the players to tussle with. Not everything would be so easily given to them, and part of the fun of this mechanic was supposed to be the exploration of the properties to experiment with. After all, the core to interest in game design is the challenge it can bring the player. These challenges come in many different forms, and the form I was aiming for was the exploration of the possibility space of environmental objects for the player to find their own emergent answer to the events that would occur in the world. To test the game, I got a small group of friends to play my mechanic, both before I created the puzzles and after, to gauge their thoughts and opinions. The main criticisms before the puzzles were implemented was a lack of user interface and important information communicated to the player, along with, putting it lightly, god-awful controls. Until then, I only had the user interface on the low priority section of my Moscow document. I had spent so long thinking it through in my designer haven, I hadn't stopped to realize how unintuitive the controls were. Nevertheless, how making property changes simply based on the player's view of the object might not be the best idea, because I had spent so long working with it. With this critical feedback, I immediately sought about designing a more intuitive and easier to grasp control scheme and design a basic but clear and concise user interface to communicate object properties to the player, as well as when objects are actually being edited with the use of a laser beam. After iterating and playtesting again, the critical response eased a little and I started to get inquiries into the actual puzzle design itself. That was when I knew it was time to get started on creating the level for the player to have a bit of fun in. After designing and implementing the tutorial, I put the prototype in the hands of my playtesters once again and found a few areas of improvement that I could tweak to improve gameplay. For one, I found that players often wanted to stack objects and use them to reach certain places, but I hadn't implemented the ability to jump on top of objects. Furthermore, the jump itself was far too high and the player itself was far too low to the ground, rendering stacking objects kind of redundant. To fix this, I applied a ground layer mask to all the objects and reduced the jump height and extended the collision of the character's controller so the player wasn't so close to the ground and could effectively view larger objects better. I even took this further and designed a puzzle that required the stacking of objects later on in order to accomplish. I started out this project with a minor fear around coding. Scripting has always been one of my weak points as a designer, and throughout the first half of development I spent a lot of my time just learning to script in the safety of the knowledge that I could just get around to my mechanic later. I feel that, in this regard, I failed at achieving one of my design goals, that being to rapidly prototype and iterate throughout the entirety of development. I spent, in my opinion, far too long in the safety of theoretical space, and designing the mechanic on paper, which is where my strengths lie, but not starting an editor sooner. While this did have its benefits, such as more time being spent on the puzzle and level designs, I do feel that I should get a lot more comfortable with bashing out prototypes quicker and a lot sooner to help prove my concepts in the future, especially in a professional environment. Furthermore, I feel that if I had gotten started on prototyping the mechanics sooner, or made a bit more consistent progress weekly rather than just backloading it, I might have succeeded at creating my own finite state machine for the elemental states. But due to leaving it until later, I didn't feel confident enough at tackling such a large concept that seemed simple to understand but hard to implement due to the time constraints. Instead, I went for a much messier, thrown together approach that worked out in the end, but I struggled to get working due to having to rush it. Better time management could have definitely avoided this. However, the reason I'm making this statement is because I realized I was scared of nothing really. When I got more than halfway through development, I could start to see things really coming together. Not just in editor, but I was also able to make better connections from memory and recall by heart the syntax behind methods I needed. I suddenly started to thoroughly enjoy the process of scripting. Solving the problems my mechanic was having became incredibly enjoyable, and I started to love it, especially as my confidence grew from the practice I had put in at the beginning of the semester. The more I scripted, the better I got, and the better I got, the more I scripted. It was a truly fun process in which I feel I've really improved. So although I do feel I should have gotten started sooner, I also do believe the path I ended up on had its own benefits, such as more time being spent on increasing my confidence in editor and learning how to effectively use programming concepts like coroutines and interfaces. I just think I should have spent a bit more time on the finite state machine. I know for a fact that in the future I'm going to apply this and thoroughly enjoy jumping right into prototyping in editor sooner, with the important experience I accrued from developing this mechanic actively improving my abilities as a game designer. By diversifying them, I feel I am more confident than ever, and I'm incredibly excited to continue taking this further and in starting new prototypes as well. And in that, I can certainly say this mechanic was a personal success, if nothing else. Based on my playtests, I can certainly say that the mechanic has achieved being interesting, even just for players to mess around with. As for it being fun, I think it certainly has potential, but a lot more time would need to go into further puzzle designs to truly capture the emergent behavior I'd like to achieve. As for recommendations for improvements for the future would go, I think a definite improvement would be to refactor the code to create a finite state machine for the elemental states that the players can create. This would not only make the project much more extensible in terms of scaling it up, but could also create a solid foundation to build other elemental effects from. Another last improvement that could polish up the prototype would be to push for a more robust object pickup system, especially for more precision manipulation of objects, as I am relatively unhappy with the one I managed to implement, and even after several iterations of it, the one I have caused the least amount of problems with the player moving around the environment with an object in hand. Another direction I'd love to try for this mechanic is to prototype it in a slightly different format. That being, instead of using a gun, each object would have its own spatial user interface attached to it, that it gets activated whenever the player looks at the object, to which the player can edit and change the properties. Similar to Little Big Planet and Dreams, thereby freeing up more screen space and further removing the association of any kind of weapon or firearm in general to help the mechanic seem more like a tool or a power at the player's disposal. I also think this mechanic could be a very interesting tool for the education sector. It could be used to teach various aspects of material science to players through an interactive medium, or even be used to teach game development if materials were instead seen as meshes and the mechanic were extended to possibly even be able to edit the logic behind objects, similar to Glitch Space, the first-person programming game.